Greetings and welcome, everyone. We are delighted that you can participate in today's gathering. Today, as we celebrate this webinar, is also International Day of Peace. Over the centuries, the Dominican family has been blessed with champions who have inspired the development of contemporary thought and practice of social justice. St. Dominic's preaching laid a solid foundation for many Dominicans, such as Bartolomé de las Casas, Antonio de Montesinos, Francesco de Vitoria, Catherine of Siena, Rose of Lima, and many others working to promote human dignity and a more just and peaceful world. Let me say a little more about St. Catherine of Siena, who is generally seen and talked about as a mystic or helping the restoration of the papacy to Rome. But St. Catherine of Siena was more than that. She was involved in the society of her time as a justice advocate. She confronted both secular and religious leaders of her time. She was appalled that people would keep quiet in the face of injustice, and she spoke out. She also urged that when people see injustice, they should not be quiet, they should act. And one of her quotes, St. Catherine says, "Let us cry out as with a million voices, because it is silence that kills the world." Today, many people around the world are crying out, and some are paying the ultimate price with their lives. And yet, keeping quiet should not be an option. It should not be an option for Christians. It should not be an option for concerned people. It should not be an option for Dominicans. Today, we have an excellent panel drawn from around the world: Europe, Asia Pacific, Africa, North America, and South America. They will reflect on justice in the world today. So our first person is Dr. Hugo Slim, a senior research fellow at the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford University. He is also the academic director of the Oxford Consortium of Human Rights. He is an accomplished author of numerous books and articles, and an award-winning scholar. He also has over 20 years experience in international diplomacy and policy, advising government departments, the UN agencies, and international NGOs. Sister Mary Kinne belongs to the Dominican Sisters of Eastern Australia and Solomon Islands. She has a wide experience as a teacher, college administrator, and in mobilizing grassroots to act in the promotion of justice. After the 5th Asia Pacific Justice and Peace Conference in 2006, she was so inspired to team up with others to set up the Las Casas Justice, Peace and Care of Creation Center in Sydney, Australia. Sister Celestina Veloso served as the international promoter of the Dominican Sisters International Justice and Peace and Integrity of Creation. She worked diligently around the world to integrate concerns about the integrity of creation into the Order, Peace, and Justice agenda. And she is the co-author of Dominicans and Human Rights. Thierry N'Zeng is a late Dominican from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He is a passionate activist for the promotion of human rights and environmental justice. He served as a member of the Justice and Peace Commission for the National Resource Commission of the National Episcopal Conference of the Congo. And he is a researcher on mining issues. Sister Marcelline Koch served 2 terms as the promoter of justice and peace and integrity of creation for North America. And I would say she was keen at inviting me to the forum regularly. She was part of the delegation sent to visit the Dominican sisters in Iraq, the Iraqi Christians, and the Iraqi citizens whose homes were overrun by terrorists, causing them to be internally displaced. And Sister Marceline is currently active in many social justice issues. So we are honored truly to present to you a panel with such distinguished speakers. So now I invite Dr. Hugo to take the floor.
Anyedi, thank you very much indeed. And it's a great pleasure and an honor to be with you all today. This is my first time speaking to Dominicans since I started my new role at Blackfriars in Oxford. And I think I must thank Anyedi for plunging me straight in at the deep end. And it'll be for you to decide if I sink or swim in Dominican waters. And if I do sink, I have no doubt that the presentations which follow mine from the other 4 panelists will teach me how to swim. So you are champions of justice and peace, and each of you, I feel sure, has much greater everyday experience of working with people for justice and peace than I do. My career started working face-to-face with people who are suffering, but I then became swept up in teaching, writing, policymaking, and diplomacy. So most of my career has really, if I'm honest, been spent imagining the suffering of others, rather than seeing, hearing, smelling, and feeling that suffering at first hand. So I see you sitting before me today as the practical people in our discussion. I sense that you are people like St. James who believe deeply that we must be doers of the word. And as people of action, you also, I'm sure, share the psalmist's faith that we will see the good things of the Lord in the land of the living, that the kingdom of God starts here with the living. And Anyedi mentioned St. Catherine, and before I joined Blackfriars, I finally got round to reading some of St. Catherine of Siena's great dialogue. And one of the great joys, as I'm sure you all know in life, is that wonderful moment when a phrase jumps off the page straight into one's heart and stands there as a guide to life. And this happened to me when I was reading St. Catherine's prologue, and that moment when she asks God what Christians become in his love, and God answers that they become another me. And as you struggle for justice and peace in so many different places around the world, you fulfill God's desire that you become another me. And I think this is wonderful. Christ's life showed us how living out God's love involves great joy with others, and it inaugurates great positive change and great significant social progress. But it can also involve the suffering of the cross on the way to a risen life. So the life of a champion of justice and peace, it seems to me, your life, is inevitably glad and sad, joyful and painful. It is a real life. And Anyedi asked me to paint a big picture of some of the challenges facing justice and peace in the world today, the world in which we are all called to be another me. So I'll try to do those things, thinking sort of 10 years ahead. And I'll try and do 2 things in particular. First, I'll set out 3 big trends that demand justice and peace today. And secondly, I'll think about how Dominicans can work positively in today's world. So thinking of the big trends, I think it's true that it's an extraordinarily exciting time to be alive because the world is full of more people than ever before, and is changing very fast. There's a genuine make or break feel to our times. And for billions of people, there are so many good things about being alive today. More comfortable lives with better shelter, health, education, and income than many before them. But human society is still very unequal. Geography, gender, identity, and social class still determines that billions of people live really well and billions of people suffer hard lives of unfairness and discrimination. And these deep differences of living conditions and opportunity are, in fact, very close to us wherever we are. They're often just a block away. So I want to focus on three big trends, which I think will be important in shaping your challenges as champions of justice and peace. Climate crisis, the risks to peace, and the expansion of our virtual lives. So our first concern must be today with climate justice. Climate change has arrived in every country. In the Arctic, a new habitable continent is emerging from ice, while in other continents, large parts of the countries are becoming unlivable because of extremes of heat, fire, flood, and drought, like in parts of the Sahel and Afghanistan. And this poses two challenges to justice and peace. First is the immediate challenge of working out an urgent form of climate humanitarianism. Climate crisis is putting hundreds of millions of people into disaster now. Changing conditions are reducing their livelihoods, making families much poorer, increasing rural-urban migration and family separation as a coping mechanism of last resort. And justice demands that we agree basic life-saving measures for all who experience climate disaster. And this will be a complicated form of justice to work out. How much should we invest in anticipating heat waves and floods, and so protecting people in advance? How shall we best support national institutions to deliver regular climate aid as extreme weather hazards become chronic in people's lives? How shall we legally recognize and support people as they move? So that's the challenge of immediate humanitarian aid and how we organize it and how we allocate it. Second is the challenge of climate transition over the longer term. Human society must adapt to climate change by reorganizing our land use, our living spaces, and our economies. And these transitions will have enormous implications for peace and justice, because people will compete over mitigation and adaptation measures. And new definitions of basic needs and quality of life need to be worked out in the new human environments dominated by heat, flood, wind, drought, and changing patterns of infectious diseases. So we will need to work out what justice and injustice looks like in parts of the world with changed environments and newly migrated populations. Do we have a right to move repeatedly? Do we have a right to be cool? Do we have a right to be dry? How shall we share new land? When is a dam or a drainage system a just climate mitigation measure, and when is it unjust and aggressive? What is a just adaptation technology that cools us down, keeps us dry, or gets us more drinking water? What is unjust adaptation that is unfair to others? And how can we stop migration becoming trafficking and exploitation under the pressure of climate crisis? And these are just questions about human rights. What about non-human rights? How shall we value non-human life and biodiversity at a time when our own human lives are pressed up against environmental limits? How should we divide transition budgets between saving human lives now and planting trees for tomorrow? And how can we move beyond an anthropocentric view of the world and respect God's balance of human and non-human value in creation if many of us are fighting for our human lives? So one of our biggest challenges in the next 10 years for justice and peace is to work out just, peaceful, and practical answers to these huge questions of transition, adaptation, mitigation. The economic transition of climate crisis will challenge justice and peace dramatically. Climate change will cause very soon a massive relocation and revaluation of the global economy, which will bring new winners and losers. Agriculture and industry will die in some places and be born anew in others, as economic activity is physically relocated away from areas at risk of flooding and heat. Factories will move, jobs will move, people will move, money will move. As the economy is relocated and transitioned, geography will be revalued. Oil spaces in the Middle East that have been the center of the global economy, in Texas and Russia as well, will be greatly reduced in their economic value. Parts of the world that are drying up, like North Africa and the Mediterranean, will stop producing food and be dramatically devalued. Cold places that are warming up will become the breadbaskets of tomorrow and increase enormously in value. This revaluation of the world economy will pose enormous questions for justice, as billions of people fall into poverty and want to move, while billions more boom, profit with new wealth, and want to protect what they have. Just and peaceful adaptation to a new economic geography will be a huge challenge. And you Dominicans need to be with people at the front line of climate change and its economic transitions, and the inevitable conflict and disputes that will arise in those transitions. Dominicans will need to help redefine human rights and human duties in environments of extreme heat, flood, and continuous human movement and transitioning economies. And you've already seen this challenge well in advance and have rightly been campaigning for a new approach to the human rights of climate change at the Human Rights Council. My second trend is the risks to peace, other risks to peace, from rising authoritarianism, political violence, and the risk of really big war. There's a lot of peace in the world for which to give thanks. Billions of people live in largely peaceful societies, and this is a great blessing, but it's not a given. Our times are politically exciting because the world is experiencing a major shift in global power. The power of Western states and Russia is now profoundly challenged by the rise of other major powers like China and India, and important middle powers across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And there is justice in this shift. Many countries who had previously been colonized, exploited, or humiliated by Western empires or Russian empires are taking their rightful place in international society again. And the world is now polycentric or multipolar and is no longer controlled largely by one power. But this return to an age of great powers carries serious risks for world peace. Great power competition is intense today. After a period of exploring cooperation, China and the USA are now decoupling economically, digitally, and politically. Tragically, they are becoming political and military enemies, even as they still trade together or engage on global challenges like climate and health. And the risk of big war that sees major powers like the US, China, Russia, India, and Europe deploying the full forces of their enormous weaponry is real again. And this would be catastrophic, with levels of death and destruction we've not seen since the 20th century. And big war is even bigger now. It's expanded from 3 traditional domains of land, sea, and air combat into 3 new domains: outer space, cyberspace, and information space. Each of these new domains sees great powers competing over new global commons, the global commons of outer space and digital space. And justice urgently needs to decide how best these spaces are shared for the common good. We can expect outer space, religiously envisaged through history as the heavens, to become a major place of war. It is already, because terrestrial warfare is controlled from satellites in outer space and weapons are fired at Earth through outer space. But in the next 10 years, weapons will also be fired from Earth at satellites, from space at Earth, and in outer space between spaceships. Warfare is changing from the age of industrial warfare to a new era of computerized warfare, driven by artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, and the internet. And AI poses big new questions for justice. War bots, military robots, are no longer simple weapons in the hands of individual humans, but they are increasingly non-human combatants making decisions for themselves. And cyber warfare would see devastating attacks against digital systems that control a nation's energy, banking, health, and logistics services, so crashing whole societies. And here too, new rules of justice are urgently needed. These attacks may see less bodies and buildings blown apart, but they'll cause chaos, impoverishment, hunger, and sickness. Great powers are really preparing for big war today, largely in the newly labeled Indo-Pacific, but avoiding it so far and preferring instead what they call sub-threshold warfare, in which they undermine each other with disinformation, cyber attacks, and the occasional land grab. Alongside the uncertain risk of big war, there are 3 certain threats to peace: extreme authoritarianism, extreme capitalism, and political violence. Authoritarian government and capitalist competition is rising around the world, and the new great power contest is being shaped as a contest of values between authoritarianism and democracy, with China and Russia leading for authoritarianism and the US and Europe for democracy. Authoritarian government can create social order, which is sometimes better for people to live in than the violent anarchy that can follow it, as many people have discovered in Iraq, Syria, and Libya. But extreme authoritarianism is intolerable, and every authoritarian regime inflicts extreme suffering on certain groups. There is a long Christian tradition of resisting tyranny, and resistance to authoritarian governments will continue to be a necessary and courageous part of working for justice and peace in many countries in the next 10 years, just as it was in the dictatorships of the 1970s and 80s. Extreme capitalism must also be resisted. Many of you have been bravely engaged in resistance to destructive capitalist greed for many years. Unregulated greed, I think, will increase wherever governments and companies pursue unjust adaptation in climate transition, which protects them, but gravely damages other people on the planet. Dominicans will need to continue to challenge unjust capitalism through climate transition. Where governments, war is not the most common or most deadly form of organized violence today. Political violence, in fact, kills more people than war, and it's growing all around the world. Where governments are weak and corrupt, the gun is used to assert commercial and political control by gangs and mafias. Millions of people in countries like Honduras and Nigeria are dominated every day by political violence, which dictates power and authority around us. And living in the middle of political violence and finding ways to resist it is extremely difficult. But Dominicans must stay close to those who are enduring political violence. A third big trend I want to think about is the huge expansion of our virtual lives. Billions of people today live simultaneously in physical space and virtual space, and we are doing so right now. We have digital bodies and data doubles. Much that is humanly important happens digitally today in our virtual lives. We meet each other virtually and show our love for one another digitally. We work and socialize virtually. This human contact is real and meaningful, just as the old letters, phone calls, and printed photographs were also real. We're also increasingly governed virtually through our data double, a digital avatar that shows who we are in a virtual trail of data on our location, health, education, income, payments, preferences, and contacts. Our digital body can encounter everything that is human, including love, compassion, help, and liberation. But it can also experience hatred, deceit, and depression. The pandemic has shown us how living in this second world, this virtual world, can really improve our lives in myriad ways. But if we're poor, we can be excluded from this virtual world, and over 1 billion people more are still excluded from the internet. And all of us, it's also a dangerous world, this second world. We can be robbed in it, we can be hated, attacked, and cancelled in virtual space. This means that justice and peace must be championed in virtual space. We cannot avoid this second world because so much of human importance is happening there. And Dominican work and values must be alive and recognizable in virtual space. God wants another me wherever people are living digitally today. So if those are the three big risks, climate, threats to peace, and justice in our virtual lives, I want to think a bit about how we should work. How should Dominicans work today? And I don't, in truth, know enough about you Dominicans in action to say much about this. I've not yet seen how you do the word around the world in different places. So I'll just share a few thoughts. It seems to me that Dominicans have two great advantages as a movement for justice and peace. The first big advantage you have is that you are not specifically Western or Eastern, Southern or Northern. You are multipolar, like today's world. You are everywhere and you work with the hearts and hands of people from every civilization. In Dominicans, God finds another me in every culture, language, and political system of the world. This is incredibly precious and a real advantage. Secondly, you are another me in explicitly female and male forms as sisters, friars, and lay people. And this seems so important because it embodies the truth that both women and men are seeking justice and peace. This commitment to both sexes preaches powerfully to the patriarchy that still dominates and distorts so much of the world. And a third thing, I was also struck by St. Catherine's emphasis that infinite sorrow should be our primary reaction to sin and injustice. And this contrasts dramatically with today's championing of outrage and its subsequent division, censure, and cancelling that leaves no space for a change of heart, forgiveness, and reconciliation. When Dominicans express primarily sorrow in the face of injustice, they recognize our common failings and encourage positive change and mutual cooperation in the building of justice and peace. So in a way, like Jesus's parable of the wheat and the weeds, we are unwise to try and rip out and destroy everything bad within us and around us, because ripping and cancelling will damage what is good in others, in ourselves, and in the systems we need to change. So growing good things, sharing God's love, and encouraging forgiveness is better than weeding and destroying when we are championing justice and peace. I also think that Dominicans must be ready to work openly and in secret, just as Jesus did. Working for justice and peace can often be done publicly, but sometimes resistance and creative peacemaking are best done in secret at various times and various moments and various places. And finally, I think it's really important for Dominicans to be propositional in justice and peace work. You must preach the truth of injustice, how it works and who it hurts, and also preach suggestions for what can be done practically now and over time. And as you encourage others to be doers of the word, you need to suggest things that they should do. And this, of course, is the really hard part, which I'm now going to leave for you all to solve in the rest of your week together. And thank you very much for having me with you today.
Thank you, Dr. Hugo. Thank you for the points made about another me and the expansive nature of the Dominican family across the world and grounded in different reality that makes it global in one way, but also a community that is capable of living up to the challenges of today. We'll come back to questions on that. But before we go on, before I call Sister Rosemary, please, if you have questions, put it in the chat box so that we can come back to it during the Q&A. So Sister Rosemary, before you fall asleep, it's almost midnight at your end. Please take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anidi, and thank you, Dr. Hugo, for that very comprehensive view. We are in the Indo-Pacific, and we are part of the trigger point. Not a very comfortable place to be in at present, and our leaders have made a few mistakes in the last couple of weeks that have made our situation with China somewhat more difficult. However, there are good things that we could people will find. I'm hoping to show you a PowerPoint, and I'm hoping, Lawrence, we can try and do this. So maybe just have a little break while we see if we can set it up. If not, I can we'll send it to you. We can probably put it on the website.
Yes.
But when we look at the Asia Pacific region, the Dominican family is spread. We're in Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, Vietnam, China, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands. Now, all through those countries, there've been past wars and present tensions. Australia's war was with the Aboriginal people, largely hidden. But all those other countries, the World War II and other wars, have traumatized them. The Philippines is the only Catholic country in that group. The rest of us, the Catholics, are a minority. But they've been marvelous in the leadership they've given us, and also in the difficulty they've had in their own country, trying to live justice and peace. Australia is a secular country with a rather awkward colonial history. We haven't been very good at human rights in our histories. We've tried, and there have been times when we've been better, but at the moment, we're not in a good space. But political and economic imbalances then threaten human rights and world peace. Where are the Dominican champions to help us? Well, St. Dominic, first of all, selling his books to help feed those in famine. That was probably all of us thinking that. And as you pointed out, Dr. Hugo, Catherine, Rose of Lima, Martin de Porres. Martin de Porres is a great favourite, particularly with our Solomon Islanders. But also we've got our own congregation members, our friends and family. The people we meet each day are so important. And the Dominicans we meet in conferences. They've been one way in which the Australians particularly have learned what it's like on the grassroots of so many of our Asian neighbours. The Asia-Pacific conferences have been very important. And Sister Tina, it's good to see you again, as the last time we met was in Indonesia. Father Montesinos, Las Casas were the great callers for this. But the other person who really influenced Australians has been Gustavo Gutierrez. And some of you will remember meeting him in 2002, I think it was, in Manila, where he was one of the main speakers there. And he was talking about the justice and peace with the people. People called him the father of liberation theology. He kept saying, no, it was the people, the poor, who were the founders of it. That greatly influenced Sister Mary Britt, one of our sisters, and she has, it greatly influenced the Dominican family in Australia, and also Mary was part of influencing the bishops and writing some of the justice and the social encyclicals. We have a Las Casas small group, and we've worked out a banner. The Dominican family seeks truth, justice, and peace. And that first banner we took to a climate change rally in Sydney. And we'll see it. We can get it to you so you can look at it at some stage. But that banner has been on rallies then mainly for refugees, but also for Aboriginal people whose rights aren't recognised in our country. Father Kevin Toomey has been involved with the justice and peace in many years in Australia and in the world. And we've got our sisters in the Solomons, Loretta, Teresa, are busy working with the people there because they're one of the countries at most risk in terms of climate change and in terms of the instability of our region. I was lucky enough to go to the Salamanca conference in 2016. Some of you I met there, Marceline and company, and that was a great gathering. We had French and Spanish and English all getting mixed up. But when I came back, I went to the Solomons in 2017, and we had 4 workshops there. And the Solomon people themselves then were telling me what they could see their own people needed. It's a poor country. It's one of the poorest in the world, after some of the African countries, I think, in 80. But the people have got physical resources that other countries want to take from them. At that conference, we also had a French volunteer, Thibault, who was one of the Dom and Go volunteers, and we had Mark Daniels from USA, who was a volunteer then. He's now Brother Christopher, preparing for to be ordained in America as St. Joseph's Province of Dominicans. And I think that's where the future will be, with the young people who will take up this cause as volunteers when COVID's finished, and they will be able to work with people. You're right, Dr. Hugo, human rights challenges are in front of us. Recognising climate change and working to prevent global warming, speaking truth to those in power, giving priority to peacemaking and development post-COVID. The Indo-Pacific region is not, millions of people live in poverty. So standing with those working for the rights of Indigenous people, asylum seekers, refugees, migrant workers. Dr. Hugo, as you pointed out, climate change is going to cause people to have to move, and migrant workers already, particularly from the Philippines, are being abused and taken advantage of. But then we need to work for the rights of children and marginalised people everywhere. A preferential option then for the poor is God's love in action. And I think we can thank everybody who contributes to our Dominican family, seeking truth, justice and peace throughout the world. We thank our congregational leaders for their support. And I thank especially for the Las Casas Tuesday Working Group, Albert and Elizabeth Jane. We've been meeting every Tuesday in school time for about 15 years. And we've been doing projects practically with the Solomons and with volunteers. But we need to thank all those champions of social justice in local communities, right? Too many to name, but all of you know them, and essential to us being good news. So thank you.
Thank you, sister. Thank you. Excellent. Yes, we need to be mindful of the champions who are alive today. So I'll call on Sister Celestina, please, to take the floor. Thank you.
Ahora sí, ¿no? ¿Me escuchan? ¿Me escuchan?
Sí, sí,
Sí,
sí.
sí.
Ok. Bueno, buenas tardes para algunos y creo que para otros ya son buenas noches y buen día. Con alegría que participo con vosotros de este gran momento para nuestra familia. Y quiero agradecer al Fray Aniel por la invitación y al doctor Hugo por la ponencia. Solamente una breve presentación, que yo hablo desde Roma, aunque yo soy brasileña, y he llegado aquí a Roma vindo de la región de la Amazonía. Por tanto, con este mirar, después de estar como promotor internacional de justicia y paz con las Dominicas Internacional, me fui allí para la región de la Amazonía con todo el grito de aquella realidad. Entonces, es desde esta mirada que quiero compartir y quiero agradecer realmente lo que nos dijo el doctor Hugo cuando nos habla del otro yo, que somos llamados a ser y a predicar con nuestra vida y con nuestras acciones. Pensar en justicia y paz con este panorama que él nos habló, con estas tendencias que él nos dijo, ¿no? La urgencia por el cambio climático, la urgencia de nuestro compromiso, sabiendo que la crisis de la humanidad hoy es la crisis humana de la humanidad, de las personas, pero también es la crisis ecológica, ¿no? Que va a afectar en la economía, en las relaciones y en lo que podemos pensar con relación al futuro. Un futuro que él nos va diciendo de 10 años, ¿qué tendríamos que aportar, qué podemos hacer, cómo dar respuestas a estos gritos de nuestra realidad desde donde estamos y desde lo que podemos hacer o que estamos haciendo. La verdad que frente a su ponencia me traía también estas dimensiones que creo que nos exige una respuesta, que para responder a los desafíos que él nos presenta con esta mirada de promover y de ser otro yo, se hace necesario el trabajo en red con otros, no solo nosotras como familia dominicana, pero también con otras organizaciones, con otros grupos que abrazan esta misma causa, que son las causas del reino, ya sea la justicia climática, ya sea la defensa de la vida de los marginados de toda esta realidad, ¿no? Él nos habla también de toda esta dimensión de la guerra, pero también desde esta guerra que se puede y que acontece, ¿no? Desde estos mundos virtuales que navegamos todos nosotros. Y sabemos de la gran influencia de los medios en la formación de la conciencia de las personas. Cómo tanta gente se deja guiarse por los fake news y nosotros como predicadores de la verdad somos llamados a denunciar y a decir la verdad que hay, la injusticia y la mentira que se dice pasando por verdad. Entonces tenemos una misión muy fuerte desde donde estamos, porque sabemos que en nuestros países y en el mundo cómo corre, ¿no? Una mentira vestida de verdad. La injusticia en nombre de Dios, en nombre de una religión, una violación de derechos humanos, de los derechos de los niños, de las niñas, en nombre de una tradición, de una cultura. Y a esta realidad tenemos una palabra, y la palabra es la verdad, que es Jesús que vino a traer la vida para todos y la dignidad de las personas, ¿no? Creo que una cosa que él no abordó, pero cuando se habla del cambio climático y es una cuestión gritante, y algunos se dice que la guerra podrá también ir por ahí, es la cuestión del agua. La escasez del agua va a hacer con que muchos países van a hacer guerra con otros países. Y ahí sabemos que quien siempre sufre con las guerras son los pobres. Aquellos que tienen acceso a la internet o que no tienen, que son los más pobres. Y allí yo puedo decir esto porque yo vivía en Acre, la región de la Amazonía, y vivimos 10 años en aquella comunidad, en medio de la floresta, sin acceso al teléfono, al medio de comunicación más sencillo, mucho menos con la internet. Pensar en la internet. Tendríamos que venir a la capital, hacer un viaje de 2 horas y media para poder comunicar con el mundo. Estamos hablando del siglo XXI, ¿no? Entonces, como esta es una realidad en tantas comunidades nuestras que están aisladas en lugares de frontera. Este es el precio que pagamos cuando realmente vamos a la periferia de la periferia, a la frontera de la frontera. Creo que es una cuestión también que me hacía pensar y reflexionar. Otra cuestión que doctor Hugo nos decía de esta familia que somos, con hermanas, con frailes, con laicos, con las monjas, esta familia que se hace grande, no solo en número, sino en presencia a tantos países y en tantos lugares grandes y pequeños. De ahí tenemos muchas mujeres comprometidas en causas que solo por el amor al reino, a Dios, que por quien abrazamos la causa de la justicia y paz, y es por amor a la humanidad. Mujeres, y sabemos de que muchas veces el lugar de la mujer aún está en segundo plano. Entonces, ¿cómo necesitamos cada vez más abrirnos a este protagonismo, a esta capacidad que las mujeres tenemos de tener otra mirada, otra manera de hacer las cosas, de buscar alternativas, de proponer riesgos y de salir adelante muchas veces sin sernos percibidas, ¿no? Entonces creo que es importante pensar en la resiliencia de las mujeres. Frente a todas esas tendencias fuertes que el doctor Hugo nos presentaba, también hay esta realidad. Y creo que para salir adelante, ¿no?, con la propuesta que él nos hace de pensarnos a 10 años las respuestas que estamos llamadas a dar, yo estoy muy convencida que es a través de la educación popular. Yo soy de Brasil y domingo pasado celebramos el centenario del nacimiento de Paulo Freire, este gran pedagogo que ha influenciado el mundo entero por su práctica de educación libertadora. Esta educación, esta concientización desde la base, desde los pobres, no vamos para enseñar, vamos para aprender y a caminar con ellos. Y es desde ahí que podemos hacer utopía, la realidad, la utopía que tanto soñamos y luchamos y creemos, que es el reino, pero es la justicia y la paz. Y es desde esta pedagogía, ¿no?, que esta mirada desde la base, desde el pequeño, estamos bien, sabemos bien con nuestra testa que los grandes, los gobiernos, nuestros líderes políticos están preocupados por otros valores, que no son muchas veces los que nosotros predicamos y luchamos. Y a ellos también tenemos una palabra. Y la palabra nuestra debe ser que nuestra predicación debe ser una advertencia a los poderosos. Como nos dijo el capítulo general de la orden hace años, ¿verdad? Que nuestra predicación sea esta advertencia, que podamos pensar desde los últimos y con ellos proponer un mundo nuevo. Otra cuestión que creo que también podemos y tenemos en mano y no olvidemos es el proceso Salamanca. Yo creo que el proceso Salamanca es una manera que nosotras como familia tenemos que abrazarlo y darlo vida. ¿Cómo integrar toda nuestra reflexión teológica, intelectual, todo nuestro saber con la práctica de lo que hacemos en defensa, en la lucha, en la promoción de los derechos humanos? Tenemos las herramientas, ¿no? Lo que tenemos es que creer que esto es posible, es dar vida. Yo creo que es una manera de ser dominicos y dominicas hoy. Y también la hermana, ahora la que me habló antes, es que ahora yo no veo el nombre de ella y olvidé, ¿no? Pero es interesante que ella recordaba el Congreso Salamanca. El Congreso Salamanca hemos concluido con una declaración final. Y la declaración traía puntos bien concretos. Entonces, con el caminar, yo creo que podemos siempre evaluar qué avanzamos, dónde estamos, dónde tenemos que seguir, por dónde caminar, cuáles son las metas, qué plan podemos hacernos todos juntos a partir de dónde estoy, de lo que yo hago, cuál es mi respuesta en este momento. Y creo que es un estilo de vida, ¿no? Sabemos que la crisis climática, con todo lo que comporta, es la opción personal, el estilo de vida, por donde yo camino, las opciones que yo hago y que vamos haciendo en comunidad y entre todos, creo que realmente podemos llegar a ser el otro yo que Dios espera que seamos. Entonces, muchas gracias por esta participación, ¿verdad? Tenemos el día 23 ahora, es el Día Internacional contra la Trata de Personas. ¿Cuántos niños y mujeres que son víctimas, que están ahí como mercaderías? Y estas causas no nos pueden ser indiferentes. Todos tenemos algo a contribuir, a dar para que nuestro mundo sea mejor. Entonces, creo que unidos podemos más. Y un abrazo muy fuerte a cada uno y muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Sister Celestina. We are grateful. Thank you for reminding us of the truth. We need to be grounded in the truth. Another name for justice, truth. Thank you for reminding us of our preferential option for the poor, which is at the heart of the gospel. So I will now call on our brother Thierry to please take the floor. Thank you.
Merci, frère Agnedi. Bonjour, la famille dominicaine. J'espère que vous m'écoutez.
Oui, on t'entend bien, Thierry.
Merci beaucoup. Je dis merci à Hugo pour son exposé qui est très riche et carrément tous les points qu'il a développés concernent l'Afrique. Ce n'est pas facile de parler de l'Afrique. Je suis à Kinshasa, en République démocratique du Congo, mais je me permets de présenter la situation de justice et d'injustice en Afrique. Parce que l'Afrique a subi la pire injustice, s'il faut l'appeler ainsi, depuis des siècles, et continue à en subir. Mais je ne pense pas qu'on va rester dans cette situation en train de pleurnicher. Il y a des gens qui nous permettent de lever la tête, de hausser la tête, cela que nous appelons les champions de justice et paix. Alors, quelle est la situation de justice et paix en Afrique? Je vais essayer de revenir à ce que Hugo a dit. Il a parlé de la crise climatique, il a parlé des risques liés à la paix et la montée de l'autoritarisme, des conflits et des grandes guerres. Pour terminer sur la vie virtuelle. Sur le dernier point, l'Afrique est à la traîne. Nous ne savons pas bien nous accrocher, nous ne savons pas suivre le lent développement de la vie virtuelle, mais avec la situation de Covid, nous tous, on s'est rendu compte qu'on on vivait dans une même vase avec les autres continents. Ce qui fait qu'on ne pouvait pas être mis de côté, on était déjà embarqué dans l'affaire. La question de crise climatique, je vais procéder par quelques réflexions. Le grand problème pour l'Afrique, c'est la pauvreté. Le grand problème pour l'Afrique, c'est cette pauvreté qui pousse aux conflits, qui génèrent les conflits. Et ces conflits sont souvent liés à l'accès aux ressources naturelles. Je me dis, si ce pays, si l'Afrique n'avait pas assez de ressources naturelles, je ne pense pas qu'on aurait eu toutes ces guerres que nous connaissons aujourd'hui. On ne sait pas accéder à ces ressources sans utiliser les armes, alors qu'il y a moyen de négocier et accéder à ces ressources, faire bénéficier tout le monde, redistribuer et appliquer la justice sociale pour que réellement chaque Africain et d'autres populations du monde puissent bénéficier des richesses que Dieu a attribuées à l'Afrique. Malheureusement, ce n'est pas le cas. Et ces conflits amènent aux violations des droits de l'homme, des violations massives des droits de l'homme que nous ne savons même pas énumérer ici, faute de temps. On accuse aussi en Afrique une faible gouvernance. La faible gouvernance se traduit par la corruption généralisée. Et qui corrompt qui? C'est souvent ceux-là qui veulent accéder aux ressources naturelles, qui amènent de l'argent pour corrompre ceux-là qui nous dirigent. Et ils ont une mainmise pratiquement même sur le processus de démocratisation, je vais y revenir, profitant de l'ignorance de la population à cause de la désinformation. La population se retrouve dans une situation de migration forcée. Je vais donner quelques chiffres ici. On se retrouve en 2019 avec environ 732 000 mouvements de déplacement. Pas personne, mais le cas de déplacement, le cas de mouvement des populations, on en a compté 732 000. Sur 732 000, il y a 718 000 qui sont liés au conflit. Les gens se déplacent, ils migrent, ils ne savent pas rester dans leur propre milieu à cause des conflits. Et 14 000 autres sont liés aux catastrophes. Oui, en parlant de crise climatique, nous en Afrique, nous rebondissons sur les accords de Paris, l'accord de Paris, qui a promis quoi aux pays africains? Ils ont promis de créer un fonds vert. Où en est-on avec ce fonds vert? Ils ont promis le transfert de technologie. Où en sommes-nous avec ce transfert de technologie? Est-ce que l'accord de Paris, c'était juste une réunion pour plaire aux grands du monde, pour faire voir à tout le monde qu'on s'intéressait à la question climatique, sans réellement prendre des résolutions qui puissent profiter à toute la planète? C'est tout ça la grande question, chers frères et sœurs. L'Afrique, la RDC, je vais rebondir sur la RDC, est le deuxième poumon, on l'appelle deuxième poumon, grâce à sa forêt, une forêt qui, on peut dire, qui est encore intacte, mais qu'on est en train de décapiter. Cette forêt sert le monde entier. La RDC a le cobalt, qui est une alternative aux énergies, aux fossiles. Au lieu d'utiliser, on peut fabriquer les batteries électriques grâce au cobalt. La RDC a ce minerai. Mais nous subissons, le pays, la RDC subit, et même beaucoup de pays d'Afrique, subissent des conflits qui sont liés à l'accès à ces minéraux. Et ce n'est pas juste cela. L'Afrique subit aussi des influences par rapport à ses propres élections. Nous voulons élire nos propres dirigeants que nous voulons. Malheureusement, ce n'est plus le cas. Nous sommes dirigés très souvent par des gens que nous n'avons pas élus, qui nous sont dictés. Les gens sont prêts à donner de l'argent pour que leur pion passe, ce qui n'est pas juste non plus. Voyez les mains basses sur les coups d'État en Afrique, commandités par qui? On ne peut pas fermer les yeux sur ça. Sur le plan de la démocratie, est-ce que tous les pays de l'Afrique ont les mêmes standards démocratiques? Si on dit on va évaluer la démocratie en Afrique, peut-on appliquer les mêmes standards à tous les pays d'Afrique? Non, ça c'est une injustice. La plus grosse injustice, c'est la question de la redistribution venue à l'intérieur. Nos multinationales ont créé des très grands riches, mais attention, ils ont aussi creusé l'écart entre les très riches et les très pauvres. C'est qu'on ne sait pas trouver une classe au milieu là, qu'on peut dire, voilà, ça c'est la classe moyenne qui fait le pont entre les très riches et les très pauvres. Il y a quelqu'un qui, je ne me rappelle plus l'auteur, qui disait, pour éliminer la pauvreté, nous n'avons qu'une seule possibilité. Parce que comme on ne sait pas rendre tout le monde riche, alors il faut éliminer les pauvres. Donc, ça explique un petit peu cette situation de guerre dans laquelle nous nous retrouvons presque en permanence. La grande question, c'est nous aujourd'hui, on se sent lésés par les multinationales qui viennent de chez vous, qui ont leur siège social dans le pays occidental, qui viennent exploiter ici en Afrique. Mais en cas de pollution de l'environnement, en cas de pollution des rivières, parce qu'on ne sait plus puiser l'eau pour nos champs, pour boire, quand ces gens-là coupent des milliers d'arbres pour accéder au sous-sol, c'est quand ils ne respectent pas leurs engagements sur le plan environnemental. Où est-ce que nous, communautés, nous pouvons porter plainte? Où est-ce que nous allons porter plainte contre ces multinationales? On n'a pas où aller. Dieu merci, nous avons les Dominicains. Nous avons les Dominicains qui sont près, qui sont proches des communautés. C'est eux qui accompagnent ces communautés dans la question de plaidoyer. Le plaidoyer se fait au niveau local, il monte au niveau national. Dieu merci, Agnès est là avec son équipe, ils le font au niveau international. C'est-à-dire, le problème de pauvreté, des problèmes cruciaux des communautés peuvent être traités au niveau international où d'autres pays font des recommandations sur nos gouvernants qui ne sont pas accessibles à nous. Raison pour laquelle nous encourageons les champions de justice et paix de ne pas se fatiguer. Nous encourageons toute la famille dominicaine à s'engager pour la promotion de la dignité de l'homme. C'est ça notre souci, nous tous. Nous encourageons tous les acteurs qui sont intéressés par cette question de justice sociale de continuer à travailler pour le salut des hommes, pour le salut aussi de tous nos continents, parce que nous avons une seule maison, c'est notre planète Terre. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Thierry. Thank you for the reminder. Thank you for already showing us the practical issues of conflict. You know, conflict of people searching for resources, conflict brought about by greed and economic expansion that our brother mentioned earlier. Thank you very much. So I will move quickly now to Sister Marceline. Please, Sister, take the floor.
Okay, thank you, Aniette, and thank you, Dr. Hugo, for being another me among us. I appreciate your enthusiasm for all of us being alive in this time. Sometimes it's hard, we hear so many negative things, so to hear that enthusiasm is important to me, and so that we share in that joy, but also recognize the infinite sorrow. We North American Dominican promoters publish a brief document, usually about every 2 years, called Gospel Call to Justice. One of the 5 issue areas is climate justice. So we are certainly on board with what you shared. Many of us have come to see it as a pro-life issue. In the United States, the polarization, not only of society, but also the church, only sees abortion as a pro-life issue. It's like it's only either one or the other. I want to share that I'm involved in anti-racism work, joining with others in efforts to dismantle racism. And in our training, we learn about 4 values that can help to transform institutions to become anti-racist. And one of the transforming institutional values is both and, rather than either or, so that you embrace multiple possibilities as we navigate these decisions in life together. In the United States, for many years, Dominican women here have been focused on earth, ecology, and the integrity that all created things have, not just a human. Many of the congregations have farms or places of trying to preserve our earth. And I think Pope Francis in Laudato Si affirms and confirms that work. You know, we hear about integral ecology that he writes, and it calls us to look at the whole and the interconnectedness of all. And I'm hearing that interconnectedness as I listen to people speak today. So one thing that I suggest, I hope all Dominicans, their related institutions and their ministries are signed up for the Laudato Si action plan. That goes along with what the Vatican is doing, as well as UISG and USG in Rome. Many of us around the world are working on earth issues, but the synergy of all of us in a concerted way can be powerful, it can be impactful. Global heating is too urgent an issue for anybody to stand aside on. When I think of our doing this way, we can look at one of the pillars of Dominican life, which is community and connected. You know, our justice work is not done alone. I heard people describe what they're doing with others. We always do it together. Networking, listening to stories of persons affected, rallying, protesting, challenging, letter writing, whatever it might be. I think many leaders, political leaders, corporation leaders, resist addressing climate change because they know it will require systems to change, and no one wants to do that. So I think people get it. There's no will to follow through. You referenced about men and women Dominicans. We US promoters or North American promoters are men and women. We have worked hard to be as partners in our justice efforts. But I have to say, beyond that, I'm not sure we've made any dent into the patriarchal power that you talked about, even in the order. And I really appreciate Aniette trying to bring us together in this way. I was very interested in the risk to peace that you shared, especially with the rising authoritarianism and political conflict. I'm thinking about, I mentioned about my anti-racism work. We citizens in the US have not faced our history of chattel slavery, nor our genocide of Native Americans. Now, there have been recent movements in the US because of events that are still going on that have brought to the fore the reality of systemic racism, that it's not just personal prejudice. It is embedded in our systems. And of course, now there's greater resistance. We have states, most of them are former slave states, that have passed laws restricting what can be taught in schools about systemic racism. That is hard. So this supremacy of whiteness and the bias against Black, Indigenous people of color, it isn't just in the US either. It extends globally. I often think colonization continues in our world today with various nations' foreign policy. It's that economic piece that Dr. Slim talked about. A few years ago, it was quoted to me that a preacher said, "I don't preach about social justice. That's a liberal agenda." And I'm here to say, as I'm guessing a lot of people in this webinar are, no, it's a gospel agenda. Look at what Jesus did. Hear what Jesus said. I mentioned before about polarization, and it comes in here very strongly. Political affiliation divides us in our work. It divides us, our nation for sure. And it also divides us in our congregations and in our provinces. Who friars or sisters follow as a presidential candidate is dividing us. So we have to take back our justice work as gospel work and continue to base it in the gospel values that they're shared in the life of Jesus, they're shared in scripture, tradition, and our Dominican tradition. And some folks have already mentioned that. I often go back to, in our work and teaching about Catholic social teaching, of using the pastoral cycle. Sometimes it's 3 steps, sometimes it's 4, but it's basically the see, judge, and act. And with judge, that includes the analysis of a situation as well as the theological reflection. And Dr. Hugo, I think the thoughts and questions you shared in the 3 trends are very helpful to us in doing the analysis about the issues. You raised many, many questions and concerns. They connect us, I think, to our pillar of study. We have to know what we're talking about and how it relates to reality. And you said something in the climate piece about there will be complicated forms of justice to work out. Issues are complex, and what I think we face, at least in the US, and I'm guessing it's other places, people want they just want a simple answer to a complex question, this little tiny soundbite that's going to solve everything, and it doesn't work. So I've often thought that we need Dominican economists to know how the economic systems work and where we can make inroads. You mentioned the economic transition for climate is going to be huge. And in your 3rd trend, I think that's an evolving one, that digital piece. And at least for me, it requires expanding my own mind and understanding to see all the implication of what's happening in our virtual world. I recently read about surveillance capitalism, which is an economic system centered on the commodification of personal data, yours and mine, with the core purpose of profit making. Now, we've commodified persons before. We only have to think of slavery as one example. And this is a new commodification of people that is challenging us. You know, our justice work is about speaking truth. It's a very Dominican thing. And often it's denouncing. You mentioned about doing it in a way that isn't outrage, you know, it's compassionate. So how we share that truth counts. Catherine of Siena also expressed that genuine truth can only be spoken in love. I connect that to her thought about infinite sorrow, that infinite sorrow should be our primary reaction to sin and justice. That we feel sorrow and that we love means that we can approach others, call out to them and call them out, challenge them, and also be open to challenge and change in ourselves. And I just have one last thought about social justice champions in the Dominican tradition. Some of us serve as promoters and are missioned with the task of leading in the effort and addressing injustices. However, I think all of us are called to this work. Excuse me. It isn't a call for everybody to stop what you're doing to take up a social or political project. No, it's a call to use the lens of justice and peace as you go about your life and your work, to let justice and peace be the perspective that shapes and flavors everything you do. There's a theologian, Cynthia Mo Lobeda, and she says that individual actions alone are not enough to dismantle systems of injustice, but systems of injustice will never be dismantled unless individuals act. And that is what we're called to. So thank you, Dr. Hugo, for lifting up the systems of injustice in our time.
Thank you, Sister Marceline. That was very comprehensive reaction and input. We are running out of time and we have questions here.
Anieri, you went. You're muted.
Yeah. I have to apologize to all that we will not be able to take all the questions, but we have questions here, at least one for each person. And I'm requesting that please take a minute to answer it in the interest of time. So the first question goes to Dr. Hugo. What role does the humanitarian community play, if any, in the field of climate change, climate justice, and peace initiative in line with the Dominican tradition? And there's a follow-up question there, is that regarding climate crisis, the immediate challenge and the transition, would you, or what would be the role in trying to work with government in addressing the climate crisis? Dr. Hugo.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the four panelists too for your very rich responses too. Thank you. I've learned a lot already. On those two questions, the humanitarian role, I think, in climate humanitarianism is the same as it is in anything. In a sense, the humanitarians are there to pick up the worst effects, the most immediate, severe forms of human suffering arising from a crisis. So that's why I think we can expect them to start seeing the disaster of climate crisis and climate injustice before some of us. So I think they will be, if you like the ambulance people, seeing the crash first. They don't necessarily always they're not in a good position to do what Sister Marceline was saying, that we need to analyze it and understand it best. But they do bring news back of the worst effects of something. And I think that's a very important role. And that they try and deal with those worst effects. And that's why I do think they need support. We're going to see people who describe their predicament as a result of climate change, increasingly destitute, moving, separated, impoverished, dying. So, in a sense, in the last 30 years, we've seen war as the main driver of human suffering in extremis. I think we're going to see climate now as an era of climate suffering. In terms of working with government, I do think that is going to be hugely important. I think it's going to be governments, and hopefully good governments, that are going to have to organize and respond and reorganize the world as climate changes it. So I think that humanitarians, civil societies, all of us must work with the government, partly to do what you've all been saying, to speak truth to it and challenge it sometimes, but also to get alongside it and add real capacity to it. There's no doubt in my mind that, we've seen this with COVID, that governments haven't been able to cope in many parts of the world, and that will be very much the same and worse with climate crisis. So we have to, I believe governments are a good thing. I think we have to help them be good at trying to deal with climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. And this goes to Sister Rosemary. Being part of the Dominican family, could we not assume that the principles of the social doctrine of the church is the true response to what God asks of us?
Yes.
Being part of the Dominican family, could we not assume that the principles of the social doctrine of the church is the true response to what God asks of us? Can we say, yes, that's a true response? Yes. What's your opinion?
Yes, I think so. And I think too, as Marceline said, the preferential option for the poor is the gospel message, right? That and the social justice teaching of the church. There's a very rich Dominican tradition with the French Dominicans who influenced the writing of the Gaudium et Spes, the Vatican Council documents, and the social justice teaching of the church in the last 100 years or so. And I think that's where all of us are called to do it at a practical level. And I suppose many people are living it without realizing it. But I think we need to, as Marceline said, the clearer you know the social justice teaching and the gospel are together, that's what we're looking at.
Thank you. And this one goes to Sister Celestina. Work for justice and peace often involves deep personal commitment. What is... Yes. Are you hearing me better now? Okay. Working for justice and peace often involves a deep personal commitment. What is your message to the youth, some who are listening to you today? Is justice and peace worth pursuing, given that many youth would rather engage in more exciting work? Sister Celestina.
Diga, aquí estoy. Sí, gracias. Pienso que sí, porque la verdad que comprometerse con la justicia y la paz es vivir el evangelio. No es otra cosa, es abrazar la propuesta que Jesús hace a sus seguidores, a toda la humanidad. Es la dignidad de la persona, es que todos tengan vida, es que nuestra casa común sea este jardín soñado por Dios cuando creó con tanta belleza. Entonces, comprometer por la justicia y la paz es comprometer en vivir, anunciar, predicar los valores del reino. Vivir lo que Jesús nos enseñó. Yo creo que no es otra cosa. Por eso es una opción personal. Yo creo que sí que se pasa por una opción personal. Pero esto se toma una dimensión mucho más fuerte cuando es asumida en comunidad como todo un proyecto de familia dominicana, de un cristianismo comprometido realmente con el mensaje que Jesús vino a traer. Entonces, es apasionante. Cuando tú te donas, tú te entregas en la defensa de la vida, de los pobres, de la creación, tú recibes mucho más. Tú te sientes que el mundo se cambia porque tú has hecho un granito de arena, pero este granito se hace la diferencia. Los jóvenes tienen que conocer más a Jesús y apasionar por él para que pueda realmente vivir esta propuesta que él nos hace. Y creo que eso es lo que podemos ofrecer como familia dominicana, ¿no? Un carisma, una antorcha viva que puede llegar a otros y otros pueblos, a otras y otras naciones y culturas, porque es una riqueza desde nuestra manera de vivir el evangelio, con el diálogo, con el respeto, con esta práctica, ¿no? De la libertad, de la pluriculturalidad. Creo que es desde ahí que podemos ofrecerlos, ¿no? La oportunidad de venir a conocer a Jesús, de abrazar su propuesta. No sé, yo creo que es así. Es ofrecer a ellos el otro yo que somos llamadas a anunciarlo.
Thank you, sister. This is for Thierry. Do you see the possibility? Do you see the possibility? Hello, Thierry, do you see the possibility of Dominicans working with
Oui,
government
je suis la traduction, oui.
in addressing climate change and other issues you mentioned? Hello, Thierry?
Exact, exact. Parce que la présence dominicaine proche, tout près des communautés qui subissent ce changement climatique. Parce qu'il y a des communautés qui vivent dans les forêts, qui voient comment leur forêt disparaît. Donc les Dominicains vivent avec ces communautés, c'est-à-dire ils accompagnent, ils soutiennent. Et comme souvent le plaidoyer au niveau local n'arrive pas à réussir, les Dominicains ont la possibilité d'amener ça au niveau national et au niveau international. Donc tout ça, nous en profitons pour demander à ceux-là qui peuvent appuyer cette action de justice et paix dominicaine à tous les niveaux dans l'accompagnement des communautés, de ne pas baisser les bras, de ne pas hésiter de nous appuyer. Donc les Dominicains ont été vraiment inspirés dans leur travail de prédication, pas seulement par la parole, mais par le vécu proche et avec ces communautés pour pouvoir donner de l'espoir à ces communautés meurtries qui n'avaient que leurs yeux pour pleurer. Mais avec le Dominicain, ils leur ont donné la parole et l'action. Venez visiter les communautés dominicaines vivant dans les milieux miniers pour comprendre le travail qu'ils font. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, thank you. And lastly, to Sister Marceline. The question to Sister Marceline is, what would be your words of encouragement to our present-day champions who continue the extraordinary work of bringing justice and peace everywhere, but particularly in North America?
Okay, what always gives me hope and encouragement in this is that I don't do this alone. As we work on something here, I can know that there are groups all over the world, for instance, that are addressing climate change. They may not be doing it in the same way, but they are doing something for Earth, or else they're trying to influence leaders, or they're doing something practical on the ground, or whatever it is. That's always been for me the hope and the encouragement. You know, when you look at these, look at what we've talked about today, this morning or this afternoon or evening. These are heavy things. And it gets to be looking like, oh my God, we can't do all of, I can't address all of this. And I don't have to address all of this. There are other people addressing it too. But I have to do something. I have to be a part of it. And I have to be willing, and I have to be willing to spend some time, some study. I also need to spend my prayer time. What I've learned, I'm from our promoters over these past decades. I think we've reclaimed the contemplative part of our life that gives us life. And so that's how I move forward, and that's what encourages me in it too.
Thank you very much. Dr. Hugo, one last sentence before we go, before I conclude it, briefly.
I haven't got much to add. I've just really enjoyed listening to you all and really enjoyed being part of a Dominican event. So thank you all very much. I think, you know, the three words we might expect, I think we have to speak the truth about all these issues and bring that truth to people's attention through preaching. And I think we have to be thankful for the community we have, as Thierry and others have said, with which we can join together and work on those problems together in the Dominican world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What an excellent panel, really.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. You have given us a lot of food for thought. We'll be discussing it, we'll be analyzing it, we'll be tearing it apart and see how we can build from that. Thank you very much. At this point, I would like to make an appeal to all of you on behalf of the delegation, the Dominican delegation at the UN. As you know, we are supporting various projects in different countries around the world in view of promoting justice and peace locally. At the same time, our representation offices are active in advocacy at the UN, office in Geneva, in New York, in Vienna, and in Nairobi. And so this is therefore an appeal to each of you to reach out to your friends who have the means to contribute financially for the continued functioning of the work of the delegation in justice and peace. And again, thank you very much for spending the time. Each time I look around the Dominican family, I am so proud of the diversity within the family, of how spread out we are, and yet how grounded we are in each locality where we are located. Thank you, God bless you, and have a good remaining of the day, night, or morning, or wherever you are located. God bless. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anidi and the team. Thank you, Lorenz, for being in the background there.
Yeah.
Thank you. What an excellent panel.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Gina.
Gracias por la translation.
Awesome. Thank you, dear. God bless.
Salam.
Arrivederci.
Thank you.
Thanks to the translation.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for your participation. Hope to meet you again.